the first thing that we really need to get, right, is that just to make sure that you have a very clear understanding of how the things work. So there is no such thing as to suppress or, reduce or, let's just overcome or any other words that we can potentially use to deal with the dystonic thing. The only way to deal with the dystonic thing is on the plus side, right? So that would be the centerpiece of my explanation, which I thought I brought in the previous one, but I will kind of need to reinforce it over and over again. So the key point that we have to keep in mind that the only way to do so is to build the new levels of strength. So which means that in order to deal with the dystonic performance and the instability of the shoulder blades, instability of the shoulder joints, the total big swing of the arms, and the similar thing as the total twist of the legs and their shift to one side and this kind of hyperextension and all these things, the only way to deal with it is by building the core, by building the elements which are normally responsible for the stability. So what are those elements? So that would be the dominant strength of the torso, right? We'll get to this later, but that means that we have to build the top connection, we have to build all the links between the individual ribs, we have to build the sufficient capacity which divides the rib cage and the abdominal level and so on. So that's, but it all starts with with a total torso. So this torso has to be stronger than the arms. That's the only way to cool it down, right? So you see, you cannot suppress it. You cannot, win over it. You cannot eliminate. You can only build the other side, right? You can only build the elements which are going to lead and dominate. So torso is the number one thing. Number two, and this is not in particular order of priority, this is just a list. Number two, that's building the dominant strength of the vertebral column. All these connections within the vertebral column, and here would be the sacrum here, right? So this entire link that goes all the way from the sacrum to the cranium, so that's number two, the dominant presence of the vertebral column itself. Number three, that's the pelvis. So again, you want to integrate the pelvis in such a way that it would be the pelvis controlling the legs, not the legs dominating over the pelvis. Number four, strong attachments of the shoulder blades, that they would be attached properly and hold, not slide over the torso. Number five, that would be the connections of the actual joints, whether it's the shoulder joints or whether it's the hip joints. So it's the connections, the stability that you need to build, right? And then after that, of course, we have to include into this the joints of the elbows, the joints of the palm and all the connections there, and the similar thing goes for the knees, for the ankle and foot. So the joint stability. So in that sense, you can only build, right? So you see, that's the key word. You cannot inhibit, you cannot suppress, you cannot reduce, you cannot fight, and so on. So the arms and the legs are dominating and the spine is moving like a snake because the connections are too weak. So that's really the key point that we have to keep in mind. The only way to deal with it is building. Of course, that line would also include, if we look from the front, that would also include the connection of the jaw and all these other components as well. So that's the number one message. So that's why when we look at what happened to Ria, how did she progress? So for us, anything that goes towards the building, that's a plus. That means that we are moving in the good direction. And of course, if something would be moving in the opposite direction, like, getting further disconnects and so on, so that would be the negative thing. So, and when we discuss those connections, we also have to take into account that it all has to do, like if we take a cross section of the body, that would be kind of layered build. So from the deep to the more superficial. So if we take a cross section, we want the deep connections to dominate and lead over the more superficial ones. So from the situation when she has a tight shell and kind of empty middle, empty inside, we want to get that distributed loads, right? And in order to build, what does it mean? That means that we want to build the connections between all the elements, right? So you see, that's what we were talking about the distributed connections. Distributed connections everywhere, along the sternum, along the ribs, along the clavicle, so like several hundreds of connections that have to build over all these elements. So that's it's not a very difficult idea to understand.